You hear the door before you see it. Iron scraping stone. Then torchlight floods the cell, and 2 guards step inside, pulling a child by the wrist. The woman on the straw pallet wakes with her heart already breaking. She knows what they've come for. Not her life, not yet. Something worse. They've come to take the last person she can touch, the last voice that still calls her mama. She lunges forward, her hands claw at wool and leather. The guard shoves her back against the wet stone, his breath sour with wine. She screams for them to stop. The boy reaches for her, his small fingers stretching through the space between them. One guard laughs, the other tightens the rope. Then they pull him through the doorway, and his cries grow faint, swallowed by the corridor's dark. The key turns. The silence that follows is not empty. It hums with everything she has lost. Before we go further, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? It amazes me every time that a story like this, buried in old prison records and faded letters, still finds people across the world who want to understand what really happened. The woman left in that cell was Marie Antoinette. The year was 1793. The revolution that had promised liberty and equality had become something else entirely, a machine that fed on spectacle, on humiliation, on the systematic destruction of anyone who represented the old world. And no one represented it more completely than the woman who had once been Queen of France. But what they did to her in those final months, in the dark beneath Paris, was not about justice. It was about breaking a symbol so thoroughly that no one would dare remember it whole. What followed was not just imprisonment. It was erasure, performed in stages, each one designed to strip away another layer of identity until nothing remained but a body to be displayed and discarded. Marie Antoinette had not been born French. She'd been born Maria Antonia, an archduchess in Vienna, raised in gilt rooms where protocol dictated every gesture. At 14, she was sent to Versailles to marry the future Louis XVI, a boy who stuttered and preferred locks to conversation. She learned to perform, to smile through ceremony, to wear gowns that took an hour to lace. The French court watched her every move, waiting for mistakes, and she made them. She spent money. She ignored etiquette. She became the foreigner they could blame when bread prices rose and wars drained the treasury. By the time revolution ignited in 1789, she had become a caricature in pamphlets, a decadent Austrian whore, a traitor, a monster. None of it had to be true. It only had to be repeated. When the royal family was taken from Versailles, they were moved to the Tuileries Palace, then to the Temple prison. Rooms grew smaller. Servants disappeared. The children tried to keep routines, reading lessons, embroidery, prayers. For a while, there was dignity in the small rituals. A daughter reading aloud, a boy playing with wooden toys, the queen mending a tear in a dress. But dignity was not what the revolution wanted. It wanted confession, capitulation, blood. In January 1793, Louis XVI was executed. Marie Antoinette heard the cannons that marked his death. She did not see the scaffold, but she carried the sound in her body like a wound that would not close. After that, she was no longer a queen. She was evidence, a relic to be processed by the new order's machinery of justice. They moved her to the conciergerie in August. The cell was below ground. Damp seeped through the stone. There was no window, a thin pallet, a chamber pot, a single candle, and behind a screen 2 guards who watched her at all times. They watched her dress. They watched her wash. They watched her change the rags she used to manage the bleeding that had started months before and never stopped. The humiliation was not incidental. It was policy. She was to have no privacy, no moment unobserved, no gesture that remained her own. One guard, a young man named Gilbert, made comments about her body. He asked questions about her undergarments. He offered to help her bathe if she asked nicely. Another guard, Dufresne, laughed when she stumbled trying to use the chamber pot in the dark. These men had no power beyond this room, but in this room their power was absolute. Marie Antoinette's health unraveled quickly. The bleeding grew worse. She developed a fever. Her hair, once the subject of elaborate styles and fashion, began to turn white at the roots. She lost weight. Her clothes hung loose. There was no doctor, no medicine. When she asked for bandages, she was given coarse cloth that chafed and didn't absorb. Infections set in. Pain became a constant companion. She could not sleep more than an hour at a time. The guards noted her condition in reports but did nothing to relieve it. The state had decided that care was a privilege reserved for citizens, and she was no longer one. She was a case to be closed, a spectacle to be prepared. But the cruelty was not only physical, They came for her son in July, 2 months before her trial. Louis Charles was 8 years old. He had lived his entire life in captivity. He did not understand politics or treason. He understood only that men in uniforms frightened him and that his mother's arms were the only safe place left. When they dragged him from the cell, Marie Antoinette fought. She bit, she scratched, she screamed, until her voice cracked. The boy cried for her, the guards pulled harder, and then he was gone. The door slammed shut. She collapsed on the floor and did not move for hours. What they did to the boy next was calculated to wound her in ways no blade could match. Louis Charles was given to a man named Antoine Simon, a cobbler with a taste for cruelty and a revolutionary zeal. Simon's task was simple: re-educate the child, teach him to despise his mother, force him to repeat lies that could be used in court. The boy was starved, he was beaten, he was taught obscene songs that mocked the royal family. He was forced to drink until he vomited, then made to clean it up while Simon laughed. And then, in a small room with men who recorded every word, the boy was made to say things no child should say. They told him to accuse his mother of sexual abuse. They coached him, they threatened him, and eventually, broken by fear and hunger and isolation, he repeated the words. The confession was written down. It was signed by witnesses, and it became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Marie Antoinette learned of the accusation during her trial in October. The Revolutionary Tribunal was not designed for fairness. It was designed for speed and spectacle. The judges had already decided the outcome. The prosecutors, led by a man named Fouquetinville, who had built his career on destroying aristocrats, presented the boy's forced testimony as proof of monstrous depravity. The courtroom filled with spectators who had come to watch the Queen brought low when the accusation was read aloud. When the claim was made that she had committed incest with her own son, the room went silent. Even hardened revolutionaries felt the weight of it. Some women in the gallery began to weep. Marie Antoinette, pale and trembling, rose to her feet. She looked directly at the women and said, "I appeal to all mothers present. Is there one among you who could believe such a thing?" For a moment, the machinery hesitated. For a moment, human empathy flickered in the room. But only for a moment. The trial lasted 2 days. She was not allowed adequate defense. Her lawyers were given hours, not weeks, to prepare. Evidence was presented without context. Letters she had written years earlier were read as proof of treason. The forced confession of her tortured son was treated as gospel. She tried to respond with clarity, but months of illness and sleep deprivation had blurred her memory. She could not recall dates. She stumbled over details. The prosecutors seized on every hesitation as evidence of guilt. The jury deliberated briefly, guilty on all charges. The sentence was death. She would be taken to the Place de la Révolution and executed by guillotine. The crowd outside cheered. Inside, Marie Antoinette sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask that revealed nothing. In the hours before her execution, the small cruelties continued. The executioner came to cut her hair, not gently, not with care, but roughly, in jagged clumps that left her scalp exposed. She was given a plain white dress, the costume of the condemned, no corset, no shoes fit for walking. She was told she would ride to the scaffold in an open cart so the crowds could see her. They did not offer her a closed carriage. They wanted her humiliation to be public, to be complete, to be the final act in the revolution's morality play. She wrote a letter to her sister-in-law in the early morning, a letter full of love and forgiveness that would be intercepted and never delivered. She ate nothing. She drank a little water, and when the guards came to take her, she stood without assistance and walked to the cart with her head high. The route to the guillotine took over an hour. The streets were packed. Some people jeered. Some threw rotting fruit. Others stood in silence, perhaps moved by the sight of a woman so reduced, perhaps simply exhausted by the endless parade of death. Marie Antoinette looked straight ahead. She did not flinch, she did not cry. When the cart reached the scaffold, she climbed the steps without help. The executioner moved to bind her hands. She allowed it. As he positioned her beneath the blade, she accidentally stepped on his foot. Her last words were an apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." The blade fell at 12:15 in the afternoon on October 16, 1793. The crowd roared. The executioner held up her severed head, and the revolution claimed another victory in its war against the past. But the story did not end with her death. Her body was thrown into an unmarked grave in a cemetery reserved for executed criminals. No ceremony, no marker, just another corpse among hundreds. Her son, still imprisoned, died 2 years later at the age of 10, neglected and diseased. Her daughter survived and was eventually released in a prisoner exchange. She carried the memory of those final months for the rest of her life, writing memoirs that tried to correct the lies, to restore her mother's humanity in the public record. It took decades before anyone cared to listen. The men who had orchestrated Marie Antoinette's trial and execution did not fare well either. Fouquier-Tinville was himself guillotined a year later when the revolution turned on its own architects. The machinery that consumed the queen eventually consumed the men who fed it. Terror, it turned out, had no natural stopping point. In 1815, after the restoration of the monarchy, a search was made for the remains of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Bones were found in a mass grave, identified by size and circumstance, though certainty was impossible. They were reburied with ceremony in the Basilica of St. Denis, given the royal funeral they had been denied in life. The gesture was symbolic, an attempt by a new government to reclaim the past, to turn victims into martyrs. But symbols do not undo suffering. They do not restore the hours spent in a damp cell, watched by men who took pleasure in degradation. They do not return the child torn from his mother's arms. They do not erase the sound of the blade. What remains then is the record, letters smuggled out by sympathetic servants, testimony from women like Rosalie Lamorlière, a maid who brought clean bandages and washed the queen's feet when no one else would, court transcripts that reveal the procedural cruelty of the tribunal, medical notes that describe the untreated illness, likely uterine cancer, that caused the constant bleeding and pain. These fragments allow us to see past the caricature, to recognize the woman beneath the crown. And what we see is not a monster or a saint, but a person subjected to systematic cruelty by a state that believed spectacle could replace justice. Marie Antoinette's story has been told and retold, twisted to serve monarchists and republicans alike, but the facts remain. A woman was imprisoned without adequate cause, denied medical care, sexually harassed by her guards, separated from her children, and forced to endure a trial built on lies extracted through torture. The revolution that justified these acts in the name of liberty and equality revealed itself capable of barbarity that rivaled any monarchy. The machinery of justice, when unmoored from restraint, becomes indistinguishable from the machinery of vengeance. There is a moment recorded by Rosalie, the servant who stayed close in those final weeks. She described the queen sitting on the edge of her pallet, braiding her white hair with shaking hands, singing softly to herself a lullaby she used to sing to her son. The guard behind the screen told her to be quiet. She stopped singing, but her lips kept moving, forming the words in silence. That image, a mother singing to a child who could not hear her, in a room designed to strip her of every dignity, is the truest monument to what happened in those cells. It is not grand or theatrical. It is simply unbearably human. The guillotine was quick. But what they did to Marie Antoinette, before the blade fell, the months of isolation, the invasion of her body, the weaponization of her children, the denial of care, the forced performance of degradation that was the real execution. It was slower, it was deliberate, and it was designed to ensure that when she finally died, there would be nothing left to mourn but the idea of a person. They succeeded in destroying the queen, but they could not destroy the record. And the record, read carefully, does not tell the story the revolution wanted. It tells the story of what happens when power convinces itself that cruelty is justice and spectacle is truth.